Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. I'm delighted that Come Carpentier Gourdon is joining me once again. This time, Come is not in Delhi. He is in Paris, where he has a home and is often there. Come, of course, is a long-time EU and India watcher. He is really one of the preeminent, experts on EU's relations with India. And today, I invited Come to have a conversation with me because, in some senses, there's been quite a seismic election in the European Union as there has been in India. Isn't that correct in some senses, Combe?
With some qualifications, because actually it hasn't been the landslide that some people were warning about or predicting. Yes, there has been a shift to the right, but not uniform and not something that is epoch-making, as some people like to say, because when you think of it, the so-called center-right has kept pretty much its position. The conventional left, if you want to call it that way, because there is not often a lot of clarity about what they mean by left, but it's still there. It's only some of the fairly extreme left-wing and green parties that have lost a lot. And the same can be said about some newfangled party or parties that claim they wanted to renew Europe. Now, everybody wants to renovate Europe, but obviously not everyone agrees as to how to do it. And the fact is that some of the relatively recent initiatives propelled by people like the French President Macron have miserably failed because people are simply not in the mood to accept a program that envisages the further strengthening of the European Union at the cost of member states, to the point of making it into some kind of a super state, as we spoke on we discussed in an earlier talk show.
Talk to us a little bit about France, Combe, then. The results have prompted Macron to call for a snap election. Talk us through what has really happened in the election, and could a party or could a candidate once described as the far right in France, could it be that she's on her way to becoming the head of state in France?
That has been on the cards for quite some time now, maybe for at least 6-7 years. But the question is that it hasn't happened, and for all we know, it may not happen because there is a very powerful coalition of vested interests on the center-right and on the left that are hell-bent on preventing this. So even though this party has now become moved much closer to the center and is in a position to make agreements with the center-right parties, we still do not know if they will break the glass ceiling. Obviously, they have been pretty much reliant on about 30% of the electorate, at least the electorate that votes, for the last 10 years or more. But still, that hasn't enabled them to win a majority. And dealing with a very astute manipulator like Macron, there are still cards that he can pull out of his sleeve to keep them at bay. We all know, for example, that Macron has been talking in the last few weeks about possibly engaging militarily with Russia in Ukraine. And not everybody believes what he says, because the perception is that he tried this to discredit his opposition by claiming that they are traitors and defeatists, whereas he's willing to fight for Europe or for whatever else. So it's obvious that this game has not him so far in this election, but it may also have put the opposition on the back foot because they didn't want to be seen as supporting Russia, which right now, of course, is a very dangerous position to take in Europe. So they had to put a lot of water in their wine, if you pass this expression, and say that, yeah, we are also in favor of supporting Ukraine, even though Ukraine is proving to be a real burden, which with no end in sight. You know, it's a complete, I would say it's a, dead end. I mean, there is nothing that one can do about it, except more people getting killed and more weapons being sent. which of course makes the a very good business for weapons manufacturers, but the rest of the economy is generally suffering from it.
So you're saying many commentators have written that this could well be the turning point for Marine Le Pen. This is the moment she had been waiting for. Like you say, she's been, waiting in the wings for a long time, but this is the turning point. You're actually saying perhaps Macron could still turn the tide.
Well, in the sense that he could, in some way, prevent power from changing hands, because he has behind him the United States, especially the current administration, as well as the European Union in general, which is dead set against, I'm talking about the European Commission, and therefore the powers that be, who are very opposed to the so-called far right taking power, because that would essentially undermine their plans for an ever closer union with an ever more powerful central authority. So this is a very hard to overcome blocking system. And that's why I'm not holding too much hope for the parties of the right, which of course have made a big gain in almost every European country, not in all, but in almost all of them. So they are not in a position to overthrow the current establishment, the current system, but they certainly can put some pressure, and they can limit the amount of reforms that would be carried out in the name of bringing Europe together, you see. And we all know that Macron's plan, you might say for his future career, is to become a sort of a super president of Europe. So it seems that his current plan would be to get Mr. Mario Draghi, the former president of the European Central Bank and the former prime minister of Italy, elected as president of the European Commission, of the European Parliament. And from there, because he's 76 years old, he would give Macron 3-4 years to succeed him and become in turn the president of the European Parliament and perhaps of the European Union, of the European Commission as well, which would make Macron a very powerful man. So we all see that there are lots of personal ambitions and calculations behind the politics of Europe.
Talk to me a little bit about where Marine Le Pen goes from here, Com. If this too is not her moment to finally become head of state in France, where does the so-called French right go from here?
Number one, the French right somehow has to unify. They haven't been very successful because in France, as in most of the European countries, the nationalist right wings are quite individualistic, or they have very separate and distinct opinions and approaches. For example, the Polish right wing is very Catholic, anti-Russian and pro-American. The Hungarian right wing is the opposite, pro-Russian and fairly anti-American, or at least anti-European Union, and so on and so forth. So it's not easy to bring together, they're like cats. You cannot herd them together easily. But if the French nationalist right can come together, then definitely they are the strongest political force in the country at present. And we all know that there are very small parties that are still asking and fighting for France to break out of the EU, essentially Frexit, like Brexit. However, the National Rally, which used to be called the National Front, has given that up, saying that what needs to be done is carry out a reform of the European Union, and France should make sure that the European Union goes back to what de Gaulle wanted it to be, which was a union of sovereign states. Whereas at present, what we have is a practically centralized authority, which is in fact unelected, because we all know that the European Parliament is not very meaningful. And in fact, more than half of the people in Europe who can vote have actually not voted this time either, because they probably don't want to bother for something which seems rather unimportant. So the question is, will the French right wing and the center right, which is practically moribund, I mean, they have lost 70% of their electorate, can they come together? If they can, then they can defeat the left, which is also very disunited. And because, you have the Socialist Party, which is still considering itself rather pro-center. Then you have the so-called Unsubmitted France, that's the name of the party, La France Insoumise, which is very, very pro-immigration, pro-Muslim, pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli. And then you have the Communist Party, which is anti-war and anti-capitalist. And these people have a great deal of trouble coming together. So if the left cannot easily come together, neither can the right, but hopefully they eventually will. And I think either someone from the National Front, not necessarily Marine Le Pen, will become president one day, or at least to begin with, prime minister, or the party clearly will remain forever in opposition, but that is not a very enviable future. Although in the current situation, many politicians feel more comfortable in the opposition and in power, because the country is facing such huge problems that as soon as you are in power, you very quickly show whether or not you can do anything about it. And maybe that is Macron's gamble, that if somehow, let's say, the National Front becomes prime minister while he, Macron, remains president, then he can pretty much put hurdles on their path and hope that they break their neck, and then he can say, you know, you have shown your incapacity, and therefore now you are basically on the downslide. So that's certainly a possibility.
Fascinating. Before we move on to another part of Europe, Come, I want to ask you a little bit about what's happening to this Europe-wide, and certainly France was an important part of it, the farmer agitations or the farm agitations. You know, what role do you think that sector or those people or that agitation, what role did it play in these elections? Does it continue to play in national politics? In France, for instance, what role does it continue to play? And what kind of pressure, might it create in the future?
You see, there is a very interesting part of the farmers' agitation, which has to do with some quite but substantial financial support from the big agro-industrial companies, because a lot of them are very opposed to the kind of reforms and new policies adopted in agriculture, which would eliminate a number of pesticides and fertilizers that are currently permitted. And that would disrupt their business, and therefore they have every reason to push the farmers to protest. Now, let me make it clear, the farmers have very legitimate reasons to protest, because they are generally the sacrificial lambs in the process of modernization, particularly the small farmers. But I have to admit the fact that they may have been manipulated by the big agro-industrial concerns that do not want anything to change. So they have had plenty of support, and they have been able, even though farmers are not very many in Europe now, you know, they are on average like 2% of the population, but they have been able to create substantial disruption. So it is certainly a factor. Right now I have seen that there is a new protest heading towards Brussels. Again, farmers are moving in their tractors, showing their discontent with some measures. So we don't know how effective, because let's face it, farmers by themselves cannot create a real mass movement. They can attract attention, but the urban city dwellers, they may be sympathetic, but they are not going to generally join them, you see. I think Europe is dealing with an enormous amount of discontent, frustration, and disappointment in the population. It has to do with the economic situation, with the high inflation, with also the perception that the government and the European administration is corrupt and dishonest, and that they are actually remote controlled by the Americans, which is something that you can hear. I was in Brussels a week ago, and there is no question that the Americans are pulling the strings, and they are telling the European leaders what they can and cannot do or say. I'll give you a simple example, not directly related to the European Union, but we are still dealing with Europe. Macron was of a mind of inviting the Russians to participate in the 80th commemoration of the 6th of June, the landing of the Allied troops in Normandy. And this was, however, forbidden by the Americans, who said there is no question of inviting the Russians, you should invite Zelensky. And Macron had to do it, because in the end, when the Americans read you the Riot Act, if you are a European leader, you cannot say no. Otherwise, you are paying a very heavy price. So ironically, Macron invited Zelensky, who proclaims himself as the heir of Stepan Bandera, who was the president of Ukraine, let's say the leader of Ukraine during World War II. And Bandera was very much a pro-Nazi who collaborated intensively with the Germans, who killed a lot of Russians, Jews, and Gypsies under German, I wouldn't say German control, but in collusion with the Germans. And then to add insult to injury, we shouldn't forget that the Ukrainians actually sent auxiliary units to help the Germans police France and keep the resistance, let's say, crush the resistance. And one of the most famous massacres committed in France was at a village called Oradour-sur-Glane, where hundreds of villagers were shot because they had harbored some resistance against the German occupiers. And who were the people who actually shot these people and burned their houses? Ukrainians. So you see the irony that now Ukrainians are feasted as, especially when they claim that they actually are proud of these people because they were fighting communists and they were protecting white Europe, So now we are at the point where, because the Americans have decided that Ukrainian Nazis are actually useful, then everybody has to say yes and claim that Zelensky is a great patriot and that the Russians were the real Nazis or the Soviets were the real Nazis. So this is the sad situation that we have come to. And this is an object lesson for countries like India, how to be aware of having too much influence from any one country. And in the case of Europe, clearly that one country is the United States of America.
Fascinating, Kom. That was an absolutely fascinating sort of segue into a most complicated but absolutely, some would say bizarre turn of events in history. Let's segue, in a sense, off to Germany now, Kom. Once again, a lot of impetus was built up that what is, colloquially called by the left as far right, the AfD and so on and so forth, will move to positions of power in Germany. Germany is also, in a sense, moved right, but perhaps not as much as some people expected.
The AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, is a very, I would say, idiosyncratically German party because it goes back to some of the old German traditions. I wouldn't consider most of them as Nazis, but they are in favor of a strong military Germany that protects itself from East and West, and that believes that they have to collaborate with Russia in order to preserve and improve German prosperity. Whereas they are very, not only skeptical, but very negative about the American role, which they claim has kept Germany as a colony, not untrue, and which recently has actually ruined the German economy by its focus on cutting off the links between Germany and Russia and blowing up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So because of all these factors, Alternative for Germany has become very strong, although it only has 15 deputies, which in the German, I think the Germans have got 91 deputies in the European Parliament, so that's not huge, but it is still more than the current party in power, at least the leading party in the current coalition, which is why there are rumors that Chancellor Scholz might resign because of the overall dissatisfaction with his tenure so far. So Alternative for Germany is obviously an irritant and can have a fairly, I would say, disruptive role in German politics. But in Europe, they are a bit isolated because most German right-wing parties don't have to have track with them because they would be accused of, making a deal with the German Nazis, which is an easy sort of aspersion to cast. Now, what's interesting, however, is that Alternative for Germany owes most of its success to East Germany, which in itself tells you that East Germany was not so anti-Soviet as it was supposed to be, because even though they were under Soviet influence, if not rule, for for several decades, they still elect a party which is very pro-Russian. Whereas in Northwest Germany, Alternative for Germany has remained very marginal, but it is doing much better in Bayern, Bavaria in the south. So you can see the Eastern formerly Soviet or pro-Soviet part of Germany and the South Catholic Germany are much more hospitable to Alternative for Germany. And that in itself tells you a lot about the way Germany is going. In a sense, you could see a split I mean, Germany was reunified not too long ago, and Baviera considers itself in some way an almost independent state. So you don't know how long and I mean, you don't know how strong German unity is. That's always a question.
The fascinating thing is, Combe, that I'm glad you mentioned East and West Germany, because if you look at the map today, once again, there seems to be a significant, with some exceptions, East-West divide as far as political options are concerned, as chosen by the Germans. Talk to us a little bit about why that is happening. Why is there such a clear West-East divide once again, as far as political options are concerned after the results of these elections?
I think you can give historical reasons as well as sociological and economic reasons. West Germany was very clearly denazified, if you want to call it that way, although let's also admit that the NATO and the European Union eagerly recruited a number of former Nazi officials to run the system. So it's not as if they systematically kicked out all the former Nazis. All you had to do is claim that you had never been a full Nazi, but that you simply served the government to get a pass. I mean, that happened quite a lot. So they realized that a lot of those German officials had a lot of abilities and therefore could be used. In East Germany, there was no such thing as a denazification. So people did not necessarily give up all their nostalgia. After all, remember, Berlin is in East Germany, and therefore it was the capital of Hitler and the historic capital of the German Empire. So East Germans remain in some way more conservative or traditional, if you want to call it that way. And more important, they were thoroughly put off and disappointed by the massive invasion of immigrants from the Middle East, the Near East, Africa, which occurred in the last 20 years. And this, for the West Germans, was somehow more acceptable because they had become more used to cosmopolitan populations. I mean, let's face it, they hosted a lot of Americans, a lot of military Americans, so they probably didn't find there was such a difference. Once you are used to having a lot of foreigners, you see more foreigners and you say, well, we have to deal with them. But in East Germany, they were very homogeneous. They had very little foreign penetration, so they just reacted very negatively, especially because of the high rate of unemployment in East Germany. So that has turned them against the establishment German parties. And that's why the Alternative for Deutschland, AfD, had such I would say, quick success in East Germany, particularly.
Let's talk a little bit about what's happening to some other parts of Europe, Combe. One of them I've been interested in is, of course, what's happening in Austria and Hungary, right? Talk to us a little bit about those countries. Orban has made very grand declarations about how Hungary would proceed, even when many of the larger Northern European states, at least, proceed in a different direction. But that has always been a stance. He's become more vocal about it. But Austria is moving to the right too. And what really happens there? What happens in Austria? What happens in Hungary? How do you see that panning out?
They are small countries, but they have a common heritage, which is the heritage of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then what we called the Visegrad Group, which essentially is constituted of Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and of course, Austria can be seen at least as an honorary member. So those countries have a distinct history. They tend to be conservative. They are afraid of Germany. They may be afraid of Russia, but they are even more afraid of Germany because they have been under German subjection for a long time, and they do not want that to continue. And we all know that Germany has been, through its investments, industrial investments, has been taking a great amount of influence in the economies and in the politics of those countries. As a result of which, you see politicians like Orban and Fico in Slovakia, who are basically taking a very, I would say, Germano-skeptic or EU-skeptic position and saying we should be able to live in friendly terms with Russia. Because we need them, and in a way we want them to counterbalance, the influence of the West, just as we expected the West to counterbalance the influence of the Soviet Union. So that is the position in those places. And it's true that, again, the mass immigration, as well as the so-called woke politics, are meeting with a very hostile response, because these countries are basically traditional. They are middle class with a lot of relatively, I would say, poor people, lower middle class, and they certainly do not want to be flooded by cheap American and Western European, you might say mass culture, if you want to call it mass culture, which is very disruptive of the balance of these societies, the family, the religion, all those factors. So you can see that their reaction is very skeptical. And in the case of Austria, of course, let's face it, Austria was a cradle of Nazism, and it has a very, between its monarchical memories, which are still very strong, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the values that some of them still remember from the Nazi days, they are certainly not comfortable with what's happening in Europe right now. And, it's a very clear fact that Europe is not a unanimously popular, as it is now. It's not a unanimously popular institution among the people of Europe. There is a sense that the current European Union is an elite project in which the people are essentially on the receiving end.
Combe, the other question that I wanted to ask you really, Combe, was that, other things are happening. While all of these things are happening in France and Germany, other things are playing out in the rest of Europe. In Belgium, the Flanders agitation for a separate state has started again. In Austria, there's been a sharp swing towards the right. And what about Scandinavia? We've seen videos of things that are happening in Denmark, in Sweden. We spoke about Sweden in an earlier conversation. There have been videos not only of that brutal stabbing in Germany, but also of people shouting at, one video said it was the Danish PM, but perhaps it was, somebody in Germany saying that, indigenous populations will be wiped out by immigrants. All of this surely is feeding into the politics and the election results.
Yes, it is. And clearly there is an official policy to repress any kind of serious discussion about this problem. So the immigration issue is front and center, even though in certain countries like Sweden, it seems to have taken a backseat because the right-wing party of the Swedish Democrats has actually lost some seats. And we don't quite know why that is. Maybe because now the issue of NATO membership has become paramount in Sweden. There are countries that have been very badly affected by the current crisis in Ukraine, such as Finland, whose economy is suffering greatly because they have lost most of their business with Russia when they decided to join NATO. And they actually used to live off partly of that. So we know these countries now are also internally torn about what to do. And it's hard to know what will happen because remember, the Scandinavian countries, of course, have their own strategic concerns. If you look at the Baltics, they are also going very far right because I think it's a way to oppose the Russians and to, in a way, claim that they are part of this white European nationalist supremacist tradition. But what that will translate into, I don't know, because they are basically small countries and they don't call the shots. I think the one decisive factor will be the possible election of Donald Trump in November, because that would definitely polarize Europe, and it would probably give a shock in the arms of not all, but many right-wing parties.
What about Austria? Austria seems to be a very interesting case too.
Well, Austria has always had a very strong, legacy, both imperial and Third Reich, which is not entirely forgotten. So you can see a lot of that nostalgia. Also, it's a small country which now has a huge Middle Eastern population, particularly Turkish. And remember that the Turks were beaten at the doors of Vienna in the 17th century.
That's right.
Without Vienna would have become part of the Ottoman Empire. So it was a joint European effort, military effort that pushed the Turks back. So for the Austrians, this has got a lot of political, resonance, because if you go to Vienna, you will see that there is one place in the center of the city where they show you the place where the Turks stopped. And had they not stopped, they would have been taken over like Hungary was. So, these countries are very sensitive in ways that sometimes maybe the Western European countries are not, although now your Western European countries are also becoming very worried. But there is a definite gap between the average person and the ruling elite, because the ruling elite do not see things in the same way generally. And if they do, then they feel they have personal ways and means of avoiding the worst problems. And that's why when politicians rise to power, generally they become a lot milder about their immigration plans, because they do not want to alienate the ruling class, in the sense the big corporations and all that, which have some vested interest in immigration. So you can see why there is always that sense that Europeans, the average person in the street, may want something, but then he's told that this is wrong and he shouldn't want that. And then once somebody who claims to represent him takes power, then he also becomes quite I would say, more moderate in his views.
As we come towards the end of this conversation, Combe, let's talk a little bit about Scandinavia, but also about Southern Europe. We have, confined our conversation largely to Northern Europe. But what about countries like Spain and Greece? The former Greece finance minister wrote a very heartfelt and almost weeping Twitter message saying, "Oh, me and my allies have been badly thrashed in the European elections," and so on and so forth. So the left, in a sense, getting really hammering in Greece.
Yes, the left was very, I would say, disappointed the Greeks, because they were planning some big left-wing reforms in order to win some relief from the European Union's financial system, which is primarily the German lending, the German lenders. And that was totally disappointing, because in the end, these people were unable to carry out their plans and they were pushed out. People like Varoufakis, who is now crying in the wilderness.
Yes, it was Varoufakis who made this post.
Yes, because again, Greece is now definitely in the right and center-right camp. And I think that's probably because of the dependency they have on their Western European financiers and the fear they have of Turkey, which also makes them want to stick to their patrons, you might say. I remember not too long ago, we had a visit by a Greek minister, and he was telling us that the Greeks had lost a lot because they used to have a lot of Russian tourists and a lot of Russian investments, and that has dried out. So he said, we don't have any alternative for that, and we cannot buy their cheap gas anymore, and we have to replace it with more expensive energy. But then what can we do? So essentially, Greece has very little choice in the matter. And maybe it's not out of place to mention here that Turkey has just applied to join BRICS. Now, Greece had also indicated that they were interested in BRICS. So you could imagine a number of European nations actually applying for BRICS, such as Hungary, for example. But let's remember that a few months ago, Macron had even applied on behalf of France and was rejected, which means that basically nobody is unwilling to consider BRICS, because it's an alternative that's more reassuring than, say, a BRI deal, Belt and Road deal, which is a bilateral deal with China. Whereas BRICS offers the comfort of having more and more countries coming together. Therefore, you can expect a more equitable system in which not one country dominates.
And also there's India to counterbalance a lot of stuff.
Correct. Although I'm not sure how India reacts to the proposal not only the proposal, the actual application from Turkey, because there are some countries like Azerbaijan, Turkey, which are not particularly friendly to India. So India may not feel very comfortable with that, especially since now Pakistan is also an applicant. And, given that China and Russia are pretty much I wouldn't say in control, but they do have the leadership position. So India is probably scratching her collective head, wondering what to do about that. But the fact is that BRICS seems to be the talk of the town. At this time, it is the happening place, whereas the European Union is definitely not, I would say that it's not on a very promising track.
We'll talk about Russia and China another day, Com, but I also want to talk to you about Spain, which just elected a historic election, a woman leader.
Yeah, actually, this was, the fact is that Spain is very sharply divided between the left and the right is rising, especially the young new so-called far-right parties. But the left retains a certain hold, and a lot of it is because it's pretty much allied with separatist parties. That's a very troublesome issue, and I'm sure in India you wouldn't be surprised by that left-wing parties can easily make deals with the parties or groups that want to break away, as long as they get the votes, So Spain is a very clear instance of that. And you mentioned other countries in Europe which may.
Yeah,
which
the
may
Flanders
break
agitation has revived in Belgium.
Yes, well, in Belgium, it's actually a right-wing thing because the Flemish are very anti-socialist generally, so they don't want anything to do with the Eastern Belgians who are French-speaking and generally socialist, and also with a lot more immigration from Africa. So there are different phenomena, but they do have a common ingredient, which is the fact that in order to counter the rise of the nationalist right, the left makes agreements with immigrants and also with separatist forces. And that is what we see in Spain. Now, the Spanish prime minister was definitely a lame duck in the last 2 years. So eventually he had to go because his wife was caught in a scandal which entails corruption. By the way, the same is happening to Mrs. Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Parliament, which is why she may not be re-elected because she's becoming an embarrassment. And so these corruption cases obviously change the political map. But there is, let's face it, and obviously, it's not very politically correct to say that, but there is so much tokenism in politics right now. People get elected not because of what they do or what they have done, but simply because of what they are or what they claim to be, So in other words, you have to have somebody from that community because otherwise you will not look cool. And as a result, you had the Muslim head minister of Scotland, you had an Indian Prime Minister of Ireland. No, I'm not sure that this was done on the basis of sheer merit. I have nothing against these people, and I think they may be very bright, but you can see that there is a sort of now an imperative that you have to have members of communities that have not been represented in the past. So that often leads to, I'm sorry to say, to very poor leadership.
And let's wrap up this conversation, Com, by, of course, talking about one country we haven't mentioned, Italy. Giorgia Meloni has done really well in these elections too. Some would argue that her position has further strengthened, and but there have been some concerns, should I say, that after she came to power, she no longer is right enough, so to speak. So where is Meloni taking Italy?
Listen, Meloni is a very smart woman, and she has been able to build a coalition. By the way, her coalition partners have suffered in the last election because she has taken a lot of their votes for her own party. But what was very clear about Italy and Meloni is that their deal is with the United States. And they are not going to change that anytime soon because the United States has protected them from the European Union. So Meloni, by taking a very strong pro-American, anti-Chinese position, has obviously attracted the sympathy of Washington, and she has been able to keep the EU at bay, and therefore carry out some of her program, but not all, because had she tried to carry out the whole thing, she would have probably not survived. But she has been able to build a compromise, which is not working badly. I think many Italians are quite happy with her. They think the government is relatively better than what they had in the past. And the fact is that Italy has taken some very sensible positions on many issues. For example, I don't know if you saw the very picturesque statement of the deputy prime minister recently saying, if Macron wants to fight Russia, let him put on a helmet and go and fight them alone, because we have no business with that. We have nothing against Russia. We're not fighting anybody. And if he's doing it for his personal ambition, that's his problem. So you see, Italy is one of the few countries where members of the top echelon are able to say these things. And of course, it has a lot of popular appeal. So I think that, in that sense, Italy is doing fairly well. And as you know, the story is that Italy has never ended a war on the side on which it began. So
Well
they
said.
are very flexible, let's put it this way, which I think some people are holding it against them, but I think actually they are being quite wise, because why should persist in a mistake? I mean, as you say,
It's been an absolutely marvelous conversation, Combe, once again, full of great insights and equally funny wisecracks. Thanks, Combe. Always a real pleasure talking to you. I hope you have a wonderful time. I can see how beautiful and sunny Paris is from the sunshine on your face. I hope you get some wonderful sun and have a wonderful time in Paris. Thank you, Combe, once again for joining me and having this wonderful conversation on the European elections and the future of Europe. Thanks, Combe.
Thank you, Hindol. It's not too warm here, so I'm enjoying that. We have fresh breeze, unlike
Delhi
you.
Delhi is, burning. That's right. Maybe I'll come and see you in Paris too, Combe.
All right, welcome.
All right.
I'll be back anyway in about 2 weeks from now. So.
All right. Look forward to seeing you in Delhi, Combe.
All right. All the best, Hindol. Bye-bye.
Bye.